Hey guys, welcome to Gray Matter Project. My name is Soraya. I'm the founder and co-director of the project. Welcome to our first lecture. Today we'll be learning about neuroanatomy, just the basics of neuroscience, neurology, and the lecture will be given to us by the wonderful Dr. Dewey.
Good. And as you see, we're being recorded, so this will be available into posterity. And thanks to those who are putting their names and locations in the chat. It's exciting to see where everybody is. These instructions will come up again with each question, so if you lose them or the window closes or whatever, no big deal. All right, I'm going to move on. So what is the nervous system? I think it's what brought us all here. It's certainly why Dr. Schaefer and I do what we do. And it's one of the many systems of the body, but it's the system that really controls who we are and what we do. And so it controls everyday activities, voluntary and involuntary movement. It obviously controls your thoughts, or at least it's the source of your thoughts. Some would argue the thoughts control the nervous system. I don't think we've straightened that out quite yet. It controls homeostasis, meaning keeping your body temperature regular, keeping your thirst appropriate, keeping your hunger appropriate, things like that. And it receives input from the world around you. So all of your senses, your sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, everything that you perceive in the world passes through the nervous system and is processed by the nervous system as raw data. So it's a very important system. I would argue the most important. And it has many parts, but in basic form, it's the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves, which run throughout your body. And so we're going to learn about some of those tonight. So there are many parts of the brain, and this is just the brain part of that breakdown that I just showed you. There's the cerebrum, which contains lobes, and we're going to look at each of those lobes. There's what's called the diencephalon, which is sort of beneath, you can think about it as in, but also beneath the cerebrum. That contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It also contains a structure called the epithalamus. There's the basal ganglia, which is a set of nuclei deep in the brain. There's something called the limbic system, which is another set of nuclei deep in the brain. And then there's the little tail that comes out the back of the brain. When you see drawings of the brain, that's called the brainstem. And it has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. There's also some central parts to the brain. There's the corpus callosum. There's a small gland that's extremely important called the pituitary gland. There's the cerebellum, which sits at the back of the brain and is really just translates into mini brain, essentially. And then there's the spinal cord. And then out of the spinal cord come all the nerves that go into the arms, the legs, the trunk, all parts of the body. So we're going to cover each of these in turn and just talk about a couple of sort of high-level points of each. We don't really have time to get down too far into the details. So this is a picture of an early stage embryo, and this is where these names come from. So in an early stage embryo, the nervous system is really broken down into pretty basic parts. There's something called the prosencephalon, then there's the mesencephalon, then there's the rhombencephalon, and then there's the spinal cord. And what these eventually develop into is what we see in the brain, in spinal cord in later individuals. This is the same thing broken down into a little more detail. So the prosencephalon is what becomes the main part of the brain itself. And when we look at a picture of a brain, all the squiggly gyri and things that we see on the surface of the brain are really what is this area right here in the cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebral hemispheres become the cerebral cortex, the subcortical white matter, and we'll look at a picture of that in a little bit. The basal ganglia and some of the basal forebrain nuclei, which are the deeper, more primitive nuclei in the brain. Beneath that, there's what's called the diencephalon, and that has three parts, as we discussed earlier. Everything beyond that is the brainstem and the spinal cord. And so what starts off as, this is not really to scale, but what starts off as the most complex part of the brain is actually pretty small in the embryonic form. And so the mesencephalon becomes the midbrain, or that first part of the brainstem. Then the rhombencephalon becomes the pons and the medulla, and also gives rise to the cerebellum. So this is the embryonic brain. What it turns into is something like this. So this is the brain. If you cut it right down the middle of the head like that and looked at it from the side, from the inside, you would see a structure like this. So there's the cortex, which is sometimes called the telencephalon. There's the diencephalon, which is the deeper structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then there's the brainstem. So the midbrain, or the mesencephalon, the pons, medulla, and cerebellum, or the rhombencephalon, and then the spinal cord. And in between, there's these junctions between the areas that are really not sharp lines in anatomy. They're just divisions between these different spots. Now, if you cut the brain a different way, if you go like this straight down the front of the head, or what we call in the coronal plane, you get a view that looks like this. So this is a slice of the brain, kind of like a loaf of bread if you cut it from front to back. And you get two basic structures here. So one is the gray matter, which is the outside of the brain and the namesake of this project. The other is the white matter, which connects all of the different areas of gray matter together. So you can think of the gray matter as the hubs and the white matter as the network between those hubs. And it really runs in a complicated structure throughout the brain. It is traceable, and there are imaging techniques that can determine at least the direction of flow of cell material in these white matter structures. But the networks are very complex, and they really run from front to back, from side to side, from one part to another part, all over the brain, from across from left to right. And here's that structure called the corpus callosum, which we talked about earlier, which is really the left to right bridge between the two sides of the brain. And then deeper in the brain, you see things like that thalamus structure we mentioned again, the basal ganglia, which we mentioned earlier. So these deeper nuclei truly are deep in towards the center of the brain. And then all of this stuff is really made of cells, right? So what you're really looking at is a collection of cells and their tails or axons, which carry signal from cell to cell. So in the brain, we call cells neurons, but they have all the components of a cell that you learn about in biology class. They just look a little bit different, and they function differently because they have these processes sticking out of them. And what these processes really do is conduct electrical signal and chemical signal. So especially this axon, this long tail sticking out the end of the neuron, conducts electricity through it to signal another neuron by connecting to either directly to the neuron or to its dendrites. And through that, then sends a chemical signal across a small gap to create electricity in the next cell. So you go from one cell to the next cell with electricity, then chemical, then more electricity. So let's see if you've been paying attention. Which of the following is a component of the diencephalon? And if you didn't log in already, you can use the code at the top of the screen to log in. I'm going to ask you again at the end to see if you remember it. So far, we have 8 people saying the thalamus, 10. 1 saying the midbrain. I saw about 20 people logged in, so I'll give it another second to answer here. Even if you don't get to answer this one, you'll be able to log in for the future ones. Yeah, so most people are answering correctly. The thalamus is one of the 3 components of the diencephalon, and it's this deep nucleus, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but one of the deeper nuclei within the brain. Very important structure, the thalamus. Good. I didn't say this explicitly, so this might be a little bit harder, but what is the term for the most evolved area of the brain? In other words, the part of the brain that's most unique to human beings. All right, so most people are jumping all over it, and they are correct. The cerebrum is the most evolved area of the brain. So it's really those cerebral cortices that are most elaborate and evolved in human beings. What is the name of the long tail of a neuron that transmits electrical signal? Good, a lot of people paying attention. I like that. Yep, so that's the axon. The dendrite is also a little small tail out of the neuron, but it doesn't It's not the primary transmitter of electrical signal like the axon is. The synapse is what the junction between the two are, and the neurotransmitter is the chemical that travels from one neuron to the other neuron. So let's talk about the cerebrum in a little more detail. So the cerebrum is that most sort of top-wise component of the brain, really everything above the diencephalon, and it has a number of different structures in it, but we really divide it into lobes. And the main lobes are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So this is the outside of the brain, as if you were looking just with the skull taken away. And this is that midline or mid-sagittal section of the brain, as if you cut down the middle and looked at it sideways. You can also see that structure again, the corpus callosum, which is the bridge from one side to the other, and some main sulci, or those grooves between what we call the gyri. So the lumpy parts are the gyri, the grooves are the sulci. You can see some of the major sulci labeled here. The frontal lobe is where a lot of our sort of personality, higher cognitive functions take place. So a lot of our memory is stored there, although most of it's processed throughout the brain, but in the temporal lobe as well. The ability to feel emotions probably resides there. Things like controlling our impulses, acting in a societally appropriate manner, problem solving, interacting socially, the motivation to do things at all is sort of, it lives there. Motor function is a really important function of the frontal lobe, and language output. So the ability to create speech that is meaningful and say the words that we want to say all live in the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is sort of behind the frontal lobe. It's behind and to the side. And it has a lot to do with our sensory function. So our ability to process basic sensations, but then also integrate those sensations in a meaningful way. So if I was to trace the number 3 on your hand, you would be able to tell with your eyes closed that I wrote the number 3. That's a very important higher sensory function that we have in the parietal lobe as well. And really it has to do with all modalities of sensation. The sense of temperature, the sense of pain, touch, limb position. And there's some function of the parietal lobe that deals with visuospatial processing. So our ability to understand what we're seeing and the relationship between things in space lives partly in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is toward the back of the brain, and it's really our visual lobe. So it has to do with visual perception in terms of color, form, so shapes, lines, things like that, detecting motion and processing motion, recognizing depth, that one thing's in front of another or closer to us. There's also some element of face recognition, although some of that lives in the parietal lobe as well. And it's connected to our eyes by the optic nerve. So the optic nerve we'll talk about in a bit, but that's the nerve that transmits all visual data from the eyes through a couple of relay stations to the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe is the last lobe that we haven't talked about yet, and it's kind of on the sides of our brain. If you want to think about the position, it's right beneath your ears, sort of. And it has a lot to do with hearing, actually, both in terms of language, but also processing both the input of language, so recognizing language, and the output of language, so making language that makes sense. It has a lot of function for emotion and for memory. And it has some amount of perception of other sensation as well. So this is a more detailed look at the brain and its gyri. You don't really need to focus on too many details of the slide, just to know that each of these has a name, actually. So our brains are so similar that we can actually label the different gyri, and everyone should have one of those gyri if their brain is normal. So this, for instance, the temporal lobe has 3 to 4 major gyri as you go down it. The frontal lobe has a few different major gyri. Everyone's frontal lobe is separated from their parietal lobe by this central sulcus. And in front of that lives a certain function, and behind that lives a certain function. So the brain is very predictable in terms of its structure. And this was figured out over years of study and anatomical work, but also from injuries to the brain. people have discovered over time that injuries to certain parts of the brain cause predictable problems down the line. For instance, we figured out that just in front of the central sulcus lives what's called the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is kind of what it sounds like. It's the main cortex or surface area of the brain that deals with motion, motor function. So the ability to move your arm or your hand or your face, those begin here. There's other areas that contribute to that, but the main function starts here. And if you injure this from a stroke or from something directly traumatizing the brain, you lose the ability to control that part of the body depending on where you are. I'll show you an interesting picture in a second of how this sort of breaks down. The same thing goes for the sulcus right behind, or the gyrus right behind the central sulcus. So the primary sensory cortex is back here, and all of the sensation in your body is represented on this cortex. So if you injure it, you lose the ability to feel in a meaningful way in that part of your body. The primary visual cortex is way in the back of the brain in the occipital lobe. Remember, we said that was the visual lobe. And it's really where the primary visual signal goes to before it goes to these other processing areas. So if you lose that, you lose the ability to see in that part of your visual field. And then the primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe, as we discussed. And that really is your primary hearing center, but that's represented on both sides of the brain as well. So all of these are represented on both sides of the brain. And as we go through neuroanatomy lessons, you'll learn that for the most part, the left side of the brain is in charge of the right side of the body and vice versa. So that's a basic rule of thumb. If this is the left side of the brain, this is the right-sided motor cortex. It's the right auditory cortex, the right visual cortex. But we would call them the left because they're still the left side of the brain, but they deal with the right side of the body. It's confusing, but you kind of get used to it as you do more and more neurology. What's interesting is our body has a very specific representation within these cortices. So you can see here what's called the homunculus. In the homunculus, the cortex, as it goes from the middle part of the brain around to the outside of the brain, represents different parts of the body. So there's a hand part of the brain, there's a face part of the brain, there's a foot part of the brain. And so those parts, when injured, those are the body parts that get affected. So just one example of how detailed, but also how predictable this structure of the brain really is. Outside of these primary cortices that I showed you earlier, there are secondary or supplementary cortices. There are association, or you could think about as tertiary cortices. And then there's cortices or areas of cortex devoted to other functions. So every part of the brain has some kind of function, and that whole you only use 10% of your brain thing is not a real thing, because 100% of your brain does something. There's some redundancy in there, but your brain, every part is doing something. We may not be able to tell what it is, even if it gets injured. Some of it is widespread enough that you can live without parts of your brain, but it's there for a reason. So let's check in again on what we've learned. So which part of the brain controls motor function? Excellent. Which lobe of the brain is responsible for vision? Beautiful. Remember, the main way we figured this out was by injury, which is sort of morbid, but also kind of fascinating. And it's a lot of what we do as neurologists, is study the effects of these injuries in our patients. So let's talk about the deeper parts of the brain now. So we're going to talk about the diencephalon first. So the main part is the thalamus. It's the largest division of the diencephalon. It's really the relay station for sensory and motor information. So a lot of things go into the thalamus, a lot of things come out of the thalamus. It projects to a lot of parts of the brain and receives input from a lot of parts of the brain. Most of that comes and goes to the cortex, but it also sends things to the deeper structures down the spinal cord to the peripheral nerves and receives from the peripheral nerves, etc. So this is sort of a schematic, but you can see that the main systems contributing are the cortex, which is really a bidirectional relationship. So they have thalamocortical, meaning from the thalamus to the cortex, and corticothalamic, meaning the other way around, projections. There's the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, which we'll talk about, the reticular formation, which we're not really going to talk about, but is responsible for sort of alertness and keeping you awake, and the limbic system, which we'll talk a little more about as well. And then all of these inputs from really the whole body, all of the sensory inputs, the vast majority travel through the thalamus, especially if they're going to be processed by the higher parts of the brain. The thalamus itself is actually a series of subnuclei, and you can see these little sort of dividing lines between them. But there are three main sections and then many subnuclei within those sections. And each subnucleus has its own function. So you can think about them as different rooms in a complex structure, each of which has its own function. The hypothalamus is smaller. The main thing the hypothalamus does is keep us on par or keep us on the level. So it maintains what we call homeostasis. And as we said earlier, that's really the ability to keep things even across the body, fluid balance, temperature, things like that. And also helps maintain some of our appetites that affect those things. So it maintains thirst, hunger, things like that. And it does so really through the endocrine system in particular, producing hormones that are secreted, but also has connections with the autonomic system, the limbic system, etc. So which component of the diencephalon acts as a relay station? There's only three components of the diencephalon, so I can't give you a four-part question here. Excellent. So remember that thalamus, it's a key structure. It's possible to have injuries just to the thalamus. We see that sometimes in certain stroke syndromes, and they can be very complex or very widespread, I should say, in terms of affecting most of the body, even though they're very, very small. So the thalamus is critically important. Good. Let's talk about the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia are really Dr. Schaefer's area of expertise, but they're deep nuclei that have a lot to do particularly with how we move, but other functions as well. And depending on what you read, they can have anything to do with motor control, motor learning, so the ability to learn new motor tasks, but also higher functions like executive function, which is sort of a higher cognitive function, emotional behaviors, reward and reinforcement through chemicals like dopamine, addictive behaviors and habit formation. So really pretty widespread what the basal ganglia do. However, they're the biggest sort of pathology we see with them has to do with movement and the ability to execute smooth movement, either moving too much or too little. You can see a schematic of them here. I'm going to show you the book that all these are taken from too, by the way. So hang in there if you're curious about these illustrations, but and why I don't just cite each one because they all came from the same book. But you can see that they're interconnected with one another. So there's the nucleus accumbens, the caudate, the putamen, and the amygdala, and they interconnect with one another throughout their structure. So a very complex network. This is one simplified diagram of how they interact with each other, but you can see that parts of them stimulate other parts. So here you can see actually the thalamus plays a role too. Parts of them are stimulated by the cortex. Others are inhibited by certain parts of the brainstem. It's very complex. I can't even pretend to be a master of it like Dr. Schaefer is. It's just not simple. The limbic system is another system of deep nuclei. It's near the basal ganglia, but they don't necessarily overlap. So you can see that in this sagittal, mid-sagittal view again, looking from the center of the brain outward, you can see that the limbic system really takes up a lot of this sort of deep cortex here and some of the deep nuclei as well. It involves things like a structure called the amygdala, which is in the temporal lobe, the hippocampal formation. There's various cortex and gyrus involved. It's right next to the corpus callosum. And this gyrus here is called the cingulate gyrus, which is just another deep gyrus that's anatomically distinguishable in the brain. If you look at the limbic system from the outside of the brain, you can't really see very much of it. So a lot of it is sort of in that deeper central part of the brain. It's really a complex network of structures. It's not that every part of this cortex is involved in the limbic system necessarily. It's networks, it's white matter, it's gray matter, it's nuclei. But it predominantly resides in that central area and inferior or lower area of the frontal lobe. So the hippocampus is a major structure in the limbic system. It has a lot to do with memory. It has a lot to do with learning, which really is partly a memory function. And it also has some influence on spatial navigation. The amygdala is next to the hippocampus, and it's, or at least nearby, and it really has a lot to do with our emotion, especially in scary situations. So a lot of people will say the fight or flight sort of starts with the amygdala, that fear response that you get when you get really scared by something. It obviously involves more of the brain than that, but often people with damage to their amygdala, especially both amygdala, develop unusual reactions to things, unusual appetites. It's a very powerful structure for how small it is. So, which system is involved in or responsible for motor integration? Nice. Nice. Yep, it's the basal ganglia. All right, let's talk about the brainstem. So the brainstem is the sort of the opposite of the cerebrum. It's our least evolved area of the brain. In some lower life forms, they only have a brainstem. Some don't even have that. So it really just kind of depends. But the brainstem really has three parts. So the first part is the midbrain. A few different things live in the midbrain, but one of the really important ones that you notice when it's not there is eye movements. So a lot of the eye movement nuclei live in the midbrain and are responsible for most directions of eye movement. There's also some element of the midbrain that has to do with processing of the auditory and visual stimuli that come into your body, especially the automatic responses to those stimuli. So when you hear a loud sound, you turn and look toward it, or see a bright light or something like that. The thing to remember about the brainstem is everything between the brain and the spinal cord passes through it. So along with these structures that live there, there are white matter tracks of axons passing on their way down to the spinal cord. And that, by that I mean everything. So voluntary movement, sensation from the body, nerves to the face and the mouth to talk. All of these things are passing through the brainstem. So injury to the brainstem rarely has no consequence. It almost always has some consequence, and it can be major even from a minor injury. But these are some of the things that in particular may be injured from a midbrain problem. The pons is next. It's below the midbrain, above the medulla. Again, it has a lot of relay information with the brain, but also is one of the primary connections to the cerebellum, which we'll talk about. But the cerebellum is this sort of finely gyrated structure in the back here. It connects the forebrain, or the higher structures of the brain, to the hindbrain, or the lower structures. The drive to breathe and really the drive that comes from when carbon dioxide is too high in your blood affects the medulla and the pons both, but that breathing respiratory drive is partially housed in the pons. And it also houses structures in what we refer to as the reticular formation, which evolve or affect wakefulness and your ability to maintain arousal. The medulla is the lowest structure in the brainstem, physically, probably also the most primitive, and it's where a lot of our primitive reflexes live. So the heartbeat, what controls the increase and decrease of our heartbeat lives there. The respiratory drive, again, is housed here. blood pressure, cardiac function, vasodilation, so the ability to expand and contract our blood vessels is partially housed here. There are some reflexes that live here. But again, it's a lot of more primitive structures. Also, a lot of the cranial nerves that go to the lower part of the face and the mouth and the throat live in the medulla. And so it's important in that regard as well. This is a more detailed view of what the brainstem looks like. So here's the thalamus, these big structures here, which we already know all about. And then you see the main parts of the brainstem. So it's these parts running from top to bottom here. This little part here is the midbrain, the skinny part. This part here is the pons. They call this the belly of the pons, as you can kind of imagine why. And then this part down here is the medulla. And then these sort of, we wouldn't call them gyri here, but these outpouchings here represent nerve tracts that are running through the medulla. You can also see here that there are a bunch of cranial nerves poking out, and we call them cranial nerves because they go to the cranium. So there's nerves coming out of your whole spinal cord that go to your body, but there are 12 sets of nerves that go to the face or come from the face. And so those get their own designation, and you can see here they're numbered. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. That's that nerve we talked about earlier that processes all visual function. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. That's one of the nerves that affects eye movements. And they go all the way down to cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, and that goes to the tongue and affects tongue muscles and your ability to move your tongue. So the brainstem is important for that reason. All of the nuclei that go to these motor nerves and receive input from most of these sensory nerves also live in the brainstem. So if you have an injury there, you could lose the function of that cranial nerve. This is the same view from the side. There's really nothing else to say about it. Again, you see the thalamus, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. This is a table of all the cranial nerves. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip it. But again, just to reemphasize, there's 12, and these are the 12 major nerves that are responsible for your special sensory functions and the major muscles of the face and the mouth and the throat. So of those nerves, we talked about one in particular that transmits visual signals. Which nerve was that? Nice. So most people are agreeing it's the optic nerve. That is correct. The olfactory nerve does smell. The oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve are two of the three nerves that go to the eye and control eye movements. But they don't control vision itself. That's the function of the optic nerve. All right, let's talk about the cerebellum briefly. Not that it's unimportant. In fact, it's extremely important. So the cerebellum is the other main area that controls movement and motor integration. So it lives sort of underneath and behind the brainstem, underneath the occipital lobes. And it's unusual in the sense that it's actually it crosses twice the input from the cerebellum to the limbs. So unlike the brain, in which the left side of the brain controls the right arm, the right cerebellum controls the right arm. So as if it wasn't confusing enough, there's a little more to confuse you. But it really has a lot to do with measuring our movements accurately, making them smooth. Repetitive movements live here. So the ability to do things like walk with a rhythm or tap your foot with a rhythm, things like that. It also helps with some degree of postural awareness and coordination, keeping your body upright in space, helping you from swaying all about. Yeah, it's an extremely important structure. It doesn't get as much love as some of the other parts of the brain because it's maybe not quite as eloquent or quite as detailed. However, it's, again, extremely important. We'll talk about the pituitary glands because it's its own special little piece of brain tissue. So it's actually not really part of the nervous system, but it's attached to the brain directly by a little, we call it a stalk, a little string of tissue, essentially. and it controls a lot of the hormones in your body. So the controls that have to do with metabolism, growth, sexual maturation, reproduction, blood pressure, hunger, thirst. A lot of these come from the pituitary gland. And it's important because it directly abuts nervous system structures. So for instance, when people develop pituitary tumors, which are relatively common, at least maybe compared to some other kinds of tumors, they can have brain problems. And sometimes those are the first things that show up because they don't notice the loss of the hormone or the change in hormone function. So we always have to think about the pituitary gland when there's pressure on that part of the brain that's near it. The other thing that goes near it is the optic nerves. So blindness or loss of vision, at least in part of your visual field, can result from pituitary lesions as well. And then we have to think about the support structures of the brain. So the glial cells are a really important one. There are multiple types. We're not going to go into too much detail, again, just sort of in the interest of time, because I want to respect your attention spans. But needless to say, they each have their own functions. And a lot of the problems that can come from the brain may have more to do with these than we initially thought. We're discovering more and more what the functions of these cells are. One of the main things we have to worry about is actually tumors that arise from these cells, because they're some of the most numerous cells of the brain. So you're equally likely to get a tumor from one of these cells as you are from other cells in the brain. And some of the worst tumors of the brain actually come from these cells. And so we at least have to know about their existence. And I think it's behooving us to understand more and more about what they do as we understand diseases and their treatments. For instance, microglia are really important as sort of the immune system of the brain. And we're learning that when microglia go awry, they can cause direct problems with the brain itself. There's thoughts that ramping up the microglia can actually help with certain brain problems. For instance, if we could get them to eat more amyloid, then we could help with things like Alzheimer's disease. These are things that people talk about. So not my area of expertise, but definitely something that we all need to know about as neurologists. A couple more cells, cell types, which are really subtypes of glial cells. Just of note, there's actually a separate type of cell that lives only in the peripheral nervous system. There's another lecture maybe later on that you'll get if I do it again on the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk more about those cells in that lecture. And then I just want to talk about a little bit about the housing of the brain. And this is some slides that I chose to add sort of last minute today. But just to say that the brain doesn't live in a vacuum, right? It actually lives in a very protected environment. Not protected enough, unfortunately, sometimes from things like traumatic injury and things like that, but enough that we can sort of go about our daily lives and not have to worry about injuring our brains, which is actually a pretty nice thing. So the brain is covered by something called the meninges, and that's really a multi-layered structure, but it divides the middle of the brain, at least to an extent. Remember, there has to be ability for the brain to cross from one side to the other through the white matter. And then it sits underneath the brain and sort of hugs it from the bottom. It's actually very complex. So you can ignore this stuff because this is the skin and the bone. But right beneath the bone is where the dura begins. And it has a couple different layers. There's a layer against the bone, and there's another layer that's against almost the brain. There's more stuff in between. And that's what we call the dura mater. So that's the thick, tough sort of armor of the brain itself. It also serves to protect the brain from the fluid in the rest of the body. Beneath that, there's what we call the arachnoid layer, and that's really actually filled with fluid. And we call that cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then beneath that, there's what's called the pia layer, and that's a very thin layer that hugs the surface of the brain, almost like saran wrap. So you have a leathery covering it's not really leather, it's fiber, but a fibrous covering. You have a fluid-filled layer, and then you have a very thin sort of final covering that protects the brain itself. This matters because you can have problems with the dura that affect the brain. So this is a picture of what's called an epidural hematoma. When someone collects blood, usually due to trauma, outside of their dura, it can actually push on the brain itself and cause a lot of problems. This is what's called a subdural hematoma. So you can get blood under the dura and push on the brain too. And that can cause an equal number of problems. The brain obviously has a pretty robust blood supply, but it really only comes from 4 arteries, 2 on each side. So there's what we call the anterior or the front circulation, and that's from the internal carotid artery. And you've probably heard of the carotid artery before. It's the big artery right here in your neck. The artery you may not have heard of is called the vertebral artery, which runs in the back of your neck, inside the bones, the vertebrae. There's little holes that this artery runs through. And between these two, these supply the whole half of your brain on that side. And then there's matching arteries on the other side that do the other half. If you look at it from the bottom, they're actually connected to each other from side to side. So if the left side goes down, the right side can pick up the slack, at least to some extent. It's not always perfect. And the closer it goes down to where it actually enters the brain, the worse the problems are. But at least there's some redundancy built in, because the last thing you want to do is lose blood supply to the brain. This is what the arteries actually look like. So this is an angiogram where they injected dye into the carotid artery. And you can see here, this is the carotid. And then it has various parts to itself as it comes up and then divides into multiple arteries that feed that part of the brain. And you can see why we call it anterior, because it really only feeds that front 2/3 of the brain. There's not much going on back here when you inject that artery with dye. But if you inject the vertebral artery with dye, then you can see that whole back part of the brain is actually very well perfused by blood vessels. So again, this is the vertebral artery giving off its divisions into the posterior part of the brain, the cerebellum, etc. So which artery supplies the front portion of the brain? Finally got you. So it is actually the internal carotid. And a couple people were brave enough to guess it. So the internal carotid, think about it as going internally, goes into the skull, gives blood to the brain. The external carotid goes to the face. All right, let's talk briefly about cerebrospinal fluid, because I see we're running out of time. So cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid in which the brain doesn't really float, but sort of bathes. And it really is on both the inside and the outside of the brain. So as we saw in that earlier diagram, it lives in the arachnoid space, which runs along the outside of the brain and the inside. It also lives in these structures called ventricles. So you can imagine here, these are sort of deep inside the brain, but they're showing them as if you could see them from the outside. And they look kind of like, I don't really know what they look like, but they have horns. They have a frontal horn, an occipital horn, a temporal horn, and a body, which connects the 3 horns. And they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And it's actually where the fluid is created. And then the fluid from the ventricles goes out to other parts of the brain, surrounds the brain, washes down around the spinal cord, and really is responsible for, again, probably more than we realize, maybe even 5-10 years ago, in terms of maintaining brain health, maintaining the immune system within the brain, clearing the brain of debris, because cells are dying all the time and being reborn, and all sorts of things are happening that need to be cleared. So the cerebrospinal fluid is critically important to understand. This is what it actually looks like. So these are the ventricles. This is from the top now, looking down on the brain. And these are what the ventricles look like in what we call the axial section. So you can ignore all these lines, but just focus on these dark fluid-filled spaces. Those are the ventricles. So this is the body of the ventricle. This is a little section of the frontal horn. This is the occipital horn. And again, showing you that image, the cerebrospinal fluid is flowing all through this space around the outside of the brain as well. And it actually gets absorbed back into the bloodstream through what we call arachnoid granulations. So you can imagine it almost flowing into these little pockets, getting absorbed and going back into the blood where it's processed like any other bodily fluid. So there's probably some signaling that's happening from the brain to the rest of the body as well. This is a simplified drawing of the same thing. And here you can see sort of the general flow of cerebrospinal fluid. So it's made in the ventricles in this structure that's outlined in red, called the choroid plexus, flows through the ventricles, around the brain, out into these arachnoid granulations, as well as down through the center of the brain and into the spinal cord where it bathes the spinal cord. And the reason this is important is we can actually sample this fluid. So if you've ever heard of a spinal tap, not the movie, I'm probably showing how old I am by saying that. A spinal tap is where we use a little needle to actually access this fluid in which the spinal cord is floating. And that can tell us something about the pressure around the brain. It can tell us about the chemical components in that fluid, if there's inflammation around the brain or the spinal cord, etc. So it's an important test that we do often in neurology. And if you ever hear about it, that's what it means. Sometimes also called a lumbar puncture. So we're going to do all of our questions at once here and see what you learned. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly because I want to leave a couple minutes for questions and respect your time. So what is the most evolved area of the brain? And you can see how you answered previously based on the color that comes up. So I know some people didn't get a chance to answer before, and so it looks like it was unknown, but still, that's pretty good. You're correct. It is the cerebrum. Which of the following is a component of the diencephalon? Nice. Yep. Thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Good. What is the name of a long tail of a neuron that transmits electrical signal? I mean, I shouldn't be surprised. You all nailed this the first time around, but this is good. You're retaining things too. I like that. Which lobe of the brain controls motor function? The majority are correct. It is the frontal lobe. Which lobe of the brain is responsible for vision? Good. What component of the diencephalon acts as a relay station? Nice. Which system is responsible for motor integration? And some of you might be saying, hey, I thought that was the cerebellum, but just remember they work together. There's a lot of crosstalk between these systems. Good. Which cranial nerve is responsible for transmitting visual signals? Yeah, they try to make it confusing by putting oculo in there. Yeah, but it is indeed the optic nerve. And lastly, for a brief review, what already supplies the front portion of the brain? Nice. Very, very good. Well, that is it. I just want to draw your attention to two resources. So first of all, big props to Soraya for helping me with this. And the One of the main resources for this was the board review series, Neuroanatomy. It's a big book. There's a lot of stuff in there. I've seen it, but really helpful, a lot of good images. The other book that's really good and where I got most of the supplementary images from was this book called Neuroanatomy Through Clinical Cases. It's now the third edition that's available. But the person who wrote it is a professor at Yale, and we get to teach in his class every year, and it's a great class. But great book, really interesting stuff if you're interested in that kind of thing. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or use your voices or whatever. And if you don't have any questions and need to call it a night, I totally respect that.
Before we do call it a night, obviously if you have any questions, go ahead and put this in chat. But I did have a quick announcement to make towards the end, so don't leave just yet.
Want to make it now, and then that way people can.
Yeah, I mean it was just kind of like a closing statement. So
Okay, all right, then don't
yeah.
leave.
Right.
Straya, I think I would also, I don't know if you're going to mention this, but we are doing a little research project on the year. And those of you who are 18 or over should have received direct emails from Brandon. Those of you under 18, we emailed your parents and we asked them to forward the emails to you if they consent to your participation. It's really just a couple of very brief surveys, like 5 minutes. So if you haven't heard anything about this, ask your parents. And if your parents don't know anything about it, then email us and let us know. Thanks. Sorry, what did you want to say?
Oh, I was just gonna say, thank you everyone for coming to our first lecture, and for everyone's participation. I was gonna say also, if you have any questions or any suggestions of anything you want to see in the future regarding lectures or anything of that sort, feel free to email us at graymatterproject@yale.edu. I can drop that email in the chat, as well as follow us on Instagram. We do have some educational posts coming up on there, as well as constant reminders for meetings and stuff. And speaking of meetings, we do have another career panel coming up next week, I believe. Actually it's at the same time. So next Monday at 7 p.m. Our career panels are very highly interactive. They're kind of set up to allow you to be able to talk face to face on a more personal level with the professionals. And there's a lot of different really cool people coming in, so definitely come in for that. But yeah, I mean, if you guys don't have any more questions or anything, you're free to go.
I do want to also say that the career panels are not recorded. They can't be because we send you into all these different breakout rooms. So the lectures we will be recording, but the career panels you have to come.
But yeah, if you
Well,
guys don't have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and you guys can step out. We'll stick around for a minute or two if you have any questions. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming to our first meeting.